The Wasp Factory. Chapter 5, A Bunch of Flowers, Part 2. I went out very early one morning, just after the sun came up and long before anybody else woke. I went to the shed, got the kite, walked... Did I already read this? No. I mean, yes, I've read this part to you. I went out very early one morning, just after the sun came up and long before anybody else woke. I went to the shed, got the kite, walked away along the dunes and assembled it. Battered a tent peg into the ground, tied the nylon to it, then flew the kite on a short string for a while. I sweated and strained with it, even in quite a light wind, and my hands grew warm despite the heavy-duty welding gloves I had on. I decided the kite would do, and brought it in. That afternoon, while the same wind, now freshened, still blew across the island and off into the North Sea, Esmeralda and I went out as usual and stopped off at the shed to pick up the dismantled kite. She helped me carry it far along the dunes, dutifully clutching the lines and winch in her flat little chest and clicking the ratchet on the drum until we reached a point well out of sight from the house. It was a tall dune, head stuck nodding towards distant Norway or Denmark, grass-like hair swept over the brow and pointing. Esmeralda searched for flowers while I constructed the kite with an appropriately solemn slowness. She talked to the flowers, I recall, as though trying to persuade them to show themselves to be collected, broken, and bunched. The wind blew her blonde hair in front of her face as she walked, squatted, crawled, and talked and assembled. Finally, the kite was finished, fully made up and lying like a collapsed tent on the grass, green on green. The wind coursed over it and flapped it, little whip noises that stirred it and made it seem alive. The dog face scowling. I sorted the orange nylon lines out and did some tying, untangled line from line, knot from knot. I called Esmeralda over. She had a fistful of tiny flowers and made me wait patiently while she described them all, making up her own names when she forgot or had never learned the real ones. I accepted the daisy she gave me graciously and put it in a buttonhole of my jacket, left breast pocket. I told her that I had finished constructing the new kite and that she should help me test it in the wind. She was excited, wanting to hold the strings. I told her she might get a chance, though of course I would have the ultimate control. She wanted to hold the flowers as well. I told her that might just be possible. Esmeralda oohed and awed over the size of the kite and fierce doggy painted on it. The kite lay on the wind-ruffled grass like an important manta rippling. Impatient manta rippling. I found the main control lines and gave them to Esmeralda, showing her how to hold them and where. I had made loops to go over her wrists, I told her, so that she wouldn't lose her grip. She struck her hands through the braided nylon, holding one line tight and grasping the posy of bright flowers and the second line with her other hand. I got my part of the control lines together and carried them in a loop around to the kite. Esmeralda jumped up and down and told me to hurry up and make the kite fly. I took a last look around, then only had to kick the top edge of the kite up a little for it to take wind and lift. I ran back behind my cousin while the slack between her and the rapidly ascending kite was taken up. The kite blew into the sky like something wild, hoisting its tail with a noise like tearing cardboard. It shook itself and cracked in the air. It sliced its tail and flexed its hollow bones. I came up behind Esmeralda and held the lines just behind her little freckled elbows, waiting for the tug. The lines came taut, and it came. I had to dig my heels in to stay steady. Bumped into Esmeralda and made her squeal. She had let the lines go when the first brutal snap had straightened the nylon and stood glancing back at me and staring up into the sky as I fought to control the power in the skies above. She still clutched the flowers. In my tuggings on the lines, moved her arms like a marionette, guided by the loops. The winch rested against my chest, a little slack between it and my hands. Esmeralda looked around one last time at me, giggled, and laughed back, and I laughed back. Then I let the lines go. The winch hit her in the small of the back. She yelped. Then she was dragged off her feet as the lines pulled her and the loops tightened around her wrists. I staggered back, partly to make it look good on the off chance there was somebody watching, and partly because letting go of the winch had put me off balance. I fell onto the ground as Esmeralda left it forever. The kite just kept snapping and flapping and flapping and snapping, and it hauled the girl off the earth into the air, winch and all. I lay on my back and watched it for a second, then got up and ran after her as fast as I could again, just because I knew I couldn't catch her. She was screaming and waggling her legs for all she was worth, but the cruel loops of nylon had her about the wrists. The kite was in the jaws of the wind, and she was already well out of reach, even if I had wanted to catch her. I ran and ran, jumped off the dune and rolling down its seaward face, watching the tiny struggling figure behind being hoisted farther and farther into the sky as the kite swept her away. I could just barely hear her yells and shouts, a thin wailing carried on the wind. She sailed over the sands and the rocks and out towards the sea, me running, exhilarated underneath, watching the stuck winch bob under her kicking feet. Her dress billowed around her. She went higher and higher, and I kept running, outpaced now by the wind and the kite. I ran through the ripple puddles at the margins of the sea, then into it, up to my knees. Just then, something at first seemingly solid, then separating and disassociating, fell from her. At first I thought she had pissed herself. Then I saw the flowers tumble out of the sky and hit the water ahead of me like some strange rain. I waded out over the shallows until I came to them. I gathered the ones I could, looking up from my harvest as Esmeralda and the kite struck out for the North Sea. It did cross my mind that she might actually get across the damn thing and hit land before the wind dropped. But I reckoned that even if it happened, I had done my best and honor was satisfied. I watched her get smaller and smaller, then turned and headed for shore. I knew that 3 deaths in my immediate vicinity within 4 years had to look suspicious, and I had already planned my reaction carefully. I didn't run straight home to the house, but went back up into the dunes, sat there, holding the flowers. I sang songs to myself, made up stories, got hungry, rolled around in the sand a bit, rubbed a little bit of it into my eyes and generally tried to psych myself up into something that might look like a terrible state for a wee boy to be in. I was still sitting there in the early evening staring out to sea when a young forestry worker from the town found me. He was one of the search party drummed up by Diggs after my father and relations missed us and couldn't find us and called the police. The young man came over the tops of the dunes, whistling and casually whacking clumps of reed and grass with a stick.